Welcome to the podcast. The prophets speak. We are about to study chapter 11 of the second book of Chronicles, that is Divrei Hayamim Bet. We have just read in chapter 10 of the tragic split between the 10 tribes and the tribes of Yehuda and Benjamin, Judah and Benjamin. The other tribes which became eventually the portion of the nation known as Yisrael were led by Yerav'am, Jeroboam, and the two tribes, Judah and Benjamin, were led by Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. We read that they had split because Rehoboam refused to heed their calls, their request to lighten the burden, the tax burden, the labor burden that was placed upon them. And Rehoboam followed the advice of the inexperienced young assistants that had grown up in the royal household to crack down hard, and instead of getting more work out of them, they rebelled and left. Familiar story. And this revolution caused a complete rift and created two nations. Rehoboam's first reaction was to go ahead and attack the northern people to bring them back into the fold to reunite his kingdom. So Vayavo Rehoboam, we're verse 1 of chapter 11. So Rehoboam came Yerushalayim to Jerusalem. Remember, he was in Shechem, in the area that is now part of the territory of the emerging nation of Israel. Rehoboam had to run. We learned he had to escape from Shechem and run to Jerusalem because of the violence, and he was afraid he would be assassinated. He ran down to Jerusalem, Vayakel et Beis Yehuda, and he gathered together all of the families, all the people in Yehuda uVinyamin, and in Benjamin, that's Judah and Benjamin. Meo Shmonim Elef Bachoros Milchama. He gathered together 180,000 choice fighting men. Lihilachemim Yisrael, to wage war against Israel. We already using that term Yisrael, waging war against Yisrael, the other tribes, members of Israel, in order with the goal of bringing them back into the kingdom of Rehoboam. However, remember though, that the split was approved by God because the split was done for a just reason. It was done because Rehoboam refused to lighten the burden, refused to follow the proper advice of the elders, refused to care about the plight of his subjects, and therefore God decreed that Yerav'am, who stood up to defend them, should be their rightful leader. So Vayihi Dvar Adonai El Shemayahu Ish HaElohim Leimar. So the word of God, the prophecy of God to Shemayahu, the man of God, the prophet Shemaiah, as follows. This prophet is mentioned also in the book of Kings, and he was the prophet at the time. So Amor el Rechavam ben Shlomo melech Yehuda. God's instructions were, say to the Rehoboam, the king of the son of Shlomo, the king of Yehuda. So here we have the name, we had just had 2 verses ago, the name Yisrael as a reference to the northern kingdom, and the name Yehuda as a reference to the southern kingdom. But then God says, when he speaks to Shmaya, V'el kol Yisrael b'Yehuda uVinyamin leimar, and to all of the people of Israel who are living among Yehuda and Benjamin, as follows. So anyone else who remains within your jurisdiction, the area which you still have control over, in Yehuda and Benjamin, it sounds like there were other Israelites who were part of the nation of Yehuda and Benjamin, even if they were not necessarily from those tribes, but lived in the territories of Yehuda and Benjamin and are now under the jurisdiction of Rehoboam. This is the prophecy. This is what God told him to say. Ko amar Adonai, so says God. Lo sa'alu, do not go up. In other words, go up because they're going north. V'lo tilachamun, do not wage war in achechem against your brothers. Shuvu ish lebeso, go home. Every person should go home to your houses. Ki me'iti nihiya hadavar hazeh. This thing, this split, was from me. In other words, it was an appropriate split. They left for a reason, right? This is not a time for a civil war to break out, right? This is not a time to kill people because they left under duress. They left the nation under a leader who I ordained, who is standing up for their rights. Vayishmu'u et divrei Adonai, and they heard the words of God. Vayashuvu milachat el Yeravam, and they turned around and changed direction rather than going against Yeravam, Jeroboam. So if the people are fighting for a just cause, don't crack down on them just for the sake of a civil war, which it would just be needless destruction for no reason. Vayeshev, or at least for a bad reason, against what God had wanted. Vayeshev Rehoboam b'Yerushalayim. So Rehoboam. So apparently I wanted to point out something from verse 4. It says Vayishma'u, and they heard. It sounds like it was the people that heard, right? It doesn't say Rehoboam heard, that leader, the king heard the words of God and then listened and turned around. It seems like Rehoboam was humbled here. And I know I might be drawing too much inference from this verse, but the image that I'm getting here is that the people turned around and said, no, we're not fighting against our brethren. They left because they were upset, right? And Rehoboam was then left without a willing army. And Rehoboam had to then learn the difficult lesson that he needs to treat his people better. He needs to support them better because he's at potentially can lose even the people that are in Yehuda and Binyamin, which then leads us to understand why for the next few years it seems like Rehoboam improved a little bit. He did support the building, support the worship in the temple, support the worship of God, and presumably, and we'll see a couple more references in this chapter and the next one that hints to the fact that for at least for a few years, Rehoboam was slightly humbled and set on the right path. Vayeshev Rehoboam b'Yerushalayim. So Rehoboam remained in Jerusalem. He stayed and lived in Jerusalem, where he continued keeping the capital as his father Solomon and grandfather David had. Vayiven Arim Limatzar b'Yehuda, and he built fortified cities in Yehuda. So he was getting ready for war, whether this is potential war against the people of Israel that did not happen before, but he was worried may happen in the future. But more likely, as we'll find out in the next chapter in 12, he was building for war because he knew that attacks were going to come from the outside, or at least were very likely to come, as we will see in the next chapter, did indeed come very soon from Egypt. So he prepared. Even at Beit Lechem, Beit Etam, Beit Tekoa, it's going to list some of the cities. Many of these cities are very well-known cities in the Judean, in the portion of Judah and of Benjamin. Beit Lechem is Bethlehem, Beit Etam, Beit Tekoa, Viet Beit Tzor, Viet Socho, Viet Adulam, Viet Gat, Viet Maresha, right? We know Maresha is the town where the prophet Micah was from, Viet Zif. These are cities which we've have come up many times, Viet Adoraim, Viet Lachish, Viet Azekah, right? The town of Lachish and Azekah, right? Viet Tzorah, Viet Ayalon, Viet Hebron, the famous city of Hebron, right? Asher Yehuda V'Binyamin, these cities that are all located in the territory of Yehuda and Binyamin, Arei Mitzuros, he built them into cities that were fortified and ready to defend against a potential attack. Vayichazek et ha-mitzuros, and he strengthened them. In other words, after he built them, he made sure they were well supplied. Vayitein v'hem nigidim, and he put people there in charge of each town. V'yotzrot ma'achal v'shemen v'yayin, and he put storehouses full of food and oil and wine, so that they had the potential and ability to withstand a potential attack. And in every city, Tinot urumachim, He made sure that they had spears and shields by Chazkem, and he strengthened them very much. Presumably, he built nice, big, strong walls. Vayehi lo Yehuda Binyamin, and by doing this and by building these towns, it came to him. He was then in charge of Judah and Benjamin, of Judah and Benjamin. Now, it wasn't only Judah and Benjamin. Let's go on to verse 13. We'll see, because he continued the proper worship in the temple, and this is where we see that, at least for the time being, he seemed to be on the right path. And I do think that this is an indication of what he learned when he saw that his people listened to Shemaiah, listened to the prophet of God, and turned around and did not fight. They were just not in the game of fighting to keep the people together. When they kind of agreed, they understood why their northern brethren left the kingdom, because the Rehoboam was so brutally and oppressed them and forced them to work. So v'hakohanim v'halviim asher b'chol Yisrael. So now all of the priests and the Levites that were scattered throughout all of Israel, hisyatzvu alav mikol givulam. They all came upon him. In other words, they came to and gathered before Rehoboam from all of their places where they lived. They lived scattered throughout the lands of all the tribes. As we know, the Levites had homes scattered throughout all of the territories of all the tribes. However, the Levites were leaving their towns and their pasture lands, right? And they were all going towards Judah and Jerusalem, because Yeravam had abandoned them and taken away their jobs, which was to be a Kohen, to be priests and lead the service of God, right? So because all the Levites were supposed to go to Jerusalem, and that's what they were dedicated to, and only Rehoboam, right, was leading the temple and was supporting the worship of God as should be done appropriately in the temple, only in Jerusalem and not in these outlying places. And the Levites found themselves stuck under the thumb and jurisdiction of Yerovam were taken away. That job was taken away from them, so they escaped the northern kingdom and joined Rehoboam. Many of them, at least, joined Rehoboam in the southern kingdom in Jerusalem. And what Yeravam did, he took his own priests and he made his own priests for the bamot, for the high places that he built, that were also places where they worshipped the demons, and the calves, the famous golden calves that Yeravam made in temples in two places that he had made. And he told them all, worship these calves here, don't go to Jerusalem. So many of the Levites refused to participate in that and went to Rehoboam, who was still loyal to God. Israel. And from all of them, and after them, in other words, and following the Leviim, the Levites and the priests, so too from among all of the tribes of Israel, there were many of those hanosnim es livavam, that they had placed, that literally means they had placed their hearts, but this means that they had the desire and the urge and the passion, livakesh es Adonai Elohei Yisrael, to search out the God, the Lord of Israel. They did not want to give up their religion, their heritage. So Ba'u Yerushalayim, they all came to Jerusalem, Lizbach Adonai Eloheim, to bring sacrifices to God, the Lord of their forefathers. As we know, and we'll see later, and we saw in the book of Kings, this is something that got Yerovam very upset, Jeroboam, because as the people were streaming towards Jerusalem, he was afraid that would set off a cascade of events that would eventually lead to a reunification, and then potentially Rehoboam losing his special privilege as being the king of a new kingdom. Unfortunately, Rehoboam ended up not allowing people to go to Jerusalem, which solidified the split. Had the people continued doing this, then it's very likely, of course, no one ever knows what would have been if, but it's extremely likely that the people would have recognized the bonds that they had, that they shared, that all of the tribes shared. They shared a shared history, a shared bond of religion and culture, and eventually would have led to some form of reunification. But unfortunately, that's not the path that history took. And these people that were coming to visit, and the Levites and the priests that were the Levium and the Kohanim, they strengthened the nation of Yehuda, the kingdom of Yehuda, right? They brought it strength. They brought in, of course, money and goods and business when they came. But more importantly, they strengthened the legitimacy of the kingdom of Yehuda. Vayamtzu et Rechavam ben Shlomo l'shanim shalosh. And for 3 years after the split, they supported Rehoboam, the son of Shlomo, because they didn't want to have the split. So as we see, this would have led eventually to a reunification. Because for those 3 years, they went in the ways of David and Shlomo, David and Solomon for those 3 years. So those people among the other tribes also followed and were loyal to God. So, but we know later, after 3 years, Yerovam cut off this travel, and it became different. But that's a different story. But for a while, Rehoboam was leading the people in the right direction, and many from the northern tribes came, especially Kohanim and Leviim. Vayikach lo Rehoboam isha. Rehoboam took a wife, et Machalat bat Yerimot ben David. Machalat, this was his second cousin, Abihail bat Eliav ben Yishai, and also Abihail, who was the daughter of Eliav, who was one of David's brothers. So this would be a second cousin once removed, I think. Vatelid lo banim et Yush v'et Shemariah v'et Zoham. And she gave birth to those sons with those names, Yush, Shemariah, and Zoham. V'achareha lokach et Ma'acha bat Avshalom. And then he married Ma'acha, who was the daughter of Avshalom, right? Presumably, assuming that this is Avshalom, the son of David, this would also be another second cousin. Vatelid lo et Aviyavi, et Ataivi, et Zizavi, et Shlomit. Those were his children. Focusing in a minute on Avia, because we'll see in a minute he's going to be Rehoboam's successor. From all of his wives and concubines, the one Rehoboam, with whom Rehoboam had the deepest loving relationship was Ma'acha, the woman we just mentioned. Because the total, he had 18 wives, upilakshim shishim, and 60 concubines. And he had 28 sons and 60 daughters. It's a little bit lopsided ratio there, but okay. Vaya'amed lerosh Rehoboam et Aviyah ben Ma'achal v'nagid bi'achav ki lahamlicho. And Rehoboam established as the primary son, the leader of all of his children, was Aviyah, the son of Ma'achab, because his intention was that Aviyah should be his successor as king. Vayoven vayifrotz mikol banav l'chol artzos Yehuda uVinyamin, and he in an understanding way, in a thoughtful manner, he spread his sons out throughout the lands of Judah and Benjamin. So he extended his power because he had 28 sons. He had them scatter and take up like governorship positions, mayoral positions, or whatever the equivalent of the time was, scattered throughout his territory in Yehuda and Benjamin. Vayitain lahem hamazon, and he provided them, presumably those towns, with much food, larov, much food. So this would seem like he's being generous, which is a lesson that he's learning because he wasn't quite so generous in the beginning. Vayish al Hamon Nashim, and he also searched out many wives for his sons. Um, whether or not that food may have been provided just for his sons, but it seems like that was a way of treating the population a little better, and also spreading his kingdom, and make sure he kind of you know dots all the i's, crosses all the t's, make sure everyone has what they need, make sure that his house is represented, the monarchy is represented throughout the kingdom, and thus he strengthened his kingdom. And at least for a little bit of time, he was seemed to be on the right path, and he had built up the strength and the military power of the southern kingdom of Yehuda. However, when someone has this much wealth and this many wives and so many fortified cities and armies and everything, it can lead in the wrong direction, which unfortunately we will see in chapter 12. Thank you so much for studying chapter 11 together with me. Looking forward to studying chapter 12 and, of course, the rest of this wonderful and amazing book of Chronicles. Have a wonderful day.